Welcome everyone to the Keen Yoga podcast. Today we have a special episode. It's 5 of us in the room chatting about yoga, and just a short introduction for everyone in the room. So first of all, we had Rodney Yee. Rodney left Berkeley to pursue a career in dance. Many years ago now, the Oakland Ballet Company built a strong foundation in Iyengar yoga and later co-founded the how do we say that, Rodney? The Piedmont?
Piedmont.
Now it's me with the English and American pronunciation. with Richard Rosen, who's also a guest with us today. He has also a successful video career as part of the Gaiam companies. You may know him, as I did, first of all, from those beautiful videos that were, I suppose, a few years ago now, Rodney. Anyway, he lives in Sag Harbor with his partner, Colleen Seidman, and teaches worldwide as well as at Yoga Shanti. Is that okay, Rodney?
That's spot on. Thank you.
Fantastic. Right, we move on to Daniel. He left a career as a prominent journalist at Reuters and the New York Times, a foreign correspondent to concentrate on yoga and particularly yoga philosophy and history. He has a book out, The Truth of Yoga, which I recommend pretty much to most people that I end up teaching. I really love that book. Very clear, very concise, and teaches the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies as well as online in his year-long course, The Path of Knowledge. He's just about to have his new book released as well, which is The Evolution of Modern Yoga. Is that right, Daniel?
That's about right, Adam. Thank you. Yes.
Great. Lovely to have you. And The Evolution of Modern Yoga, I've been treated to a pre-read of it, and it's also super, super good. I'm actually pretty jealous because I would have loved to have written that myself. Mary Paffard. I don't know Mary as of yet, but we're just about to get to know each other a little bit. She's originally English, used to yoga in London in the 1970s, and relocated to Northern California, where she's lived off-grid for 30 years on a collective apple farm. I don't know what the collective bit of the apple farm is, Mary. And she teaches Iyengar yoga amongst a wide range of other interests, it seems, including ecology and Vipassana. Is that right, Mary?
What
would you like to add?
I would put brackets around the Iyengar.
Brackets around, okay. Great, okay. We're onto something there. Okay, and Richard Rosen, a friend of the podcast and a friend of mine, a student of yoga for 46 years, teacher of bracketed Iyengar yoga as well, maybe, for 38 years, and co-founder of that place I can't pronounce, Piedmont Yoga School, and author of five books, including the Yoga FAQ, which I really like this Yoga FAQ book. The super good book that I recommend. And more recently, Shavasana, Between Breath and Death. I've recorded a podcast with Richard and Leslie Howard on that. So welcome everyone to the Keen Yoga podcast, and let's have a good chat together today. Thanks for coming on. So to kick it off, I've thought, what better place to start than to say, well, if modern yoga's aims are now for a better embodiment, what does that mean and how does one approach it? I mean, on a most basic level, to kick off the discussion, what are we doing now and what are we aiming for in our classes? I mean, most of us are yoga teachers. Daniel is a semi-scholar, a reluctant scholar of yoga. we say you're a scholar, really. And, well, you know, anyone for 5 as a starter, what are you trying to teach people now, given that pre-20th century yoga is a different thing? Where do we land now with students coming to our classes? What kind of things are we trying to instill in them, or are we just teaching them an exotic way to stretch? Any ideas?
I like what you said about embodiment. I do believe that we tend to treat the body as sort of some object like a car. And I think it's a wonderful thing to begin to celebrate the body. And who knows really what the difference between the mind, body, breath, spirit is. And we treat these words as if they're separate entities. I like in the world of physics that they're realizing now that there might not actually be things. There's only relationship between things. So I'll just stop right there, but I really believe we're doing something really important, actually, even though it may be very diverged from the evolution of yoga, from all of these wonderful studies that we realize have some importance for now, but also maybe we need to continue to evolve.
And when I say embodiment, what does that mean for you?
For me, it actually means to live in the territory of this thing called the body and intimately be integrated between what we call mind and body, so much to the point where it's very hard to distinguish one from the other. So it's It is the natural integration of our beingness.
So we're kind of one without a second. It's kind of for the consciousness and the individual as one thing. Mary, what's your perspective? You said you bracketed Iyengar yoga. Obviously, BKS used to say alignment is enlightenment. What's your view of this asana practice? What are you looking for your students to kind of experience in your classes?
Well, I suppose it primarily befriend the body. I think many of us have tried to control and force and push, and at certain stages in our lives, perhaps that was appropriate. But I think befriending and bringing together is my definition. Sometimes when people ask me what do you mean by yoga, I say, well, it's coming home. Really, it's coming home to something that's very familiar, but also maybe feel very, very unusual to beginners, at least. And if I can help people ground, breathe, walk, stand, move with some sense of ease and grace, I feel like I'm doing a good job. And open them to the curiosity, open them to, asking questions and really respecting themselves. But I also feel like in this day and age, and maybe we'll get onto this later, is that we need to think of the body in a bigger context. It's not just this body, but it's everything. And if I can help, or I and my colleagues can help people bring themselves into more in tune with the rhythms of their own body, perhaps, well, it's not just perhaps, I see it happening, but it can create waves of deeper contact and deeper appreciation of the world that we live in.
So it definitely has a wider emphasis than just a singular meaning for oneself alone. We're spreading this definitely outwards into maybe a later question in terms of yoga's social or political aspects. Right. I suppose before we get to that, I said embodiment, and I was trying to tease something out of perhaps Richard or Daniel here in terms of the pre-20th century transcendental ideas of yoga, and if we could find a connection, or is it just simply a contradiction in terms that modern yoga talks about embodiment, and pre-20th century tends to seem to talk about disembodiment. Even the tantric stuff ideally gets you out of your body in the end, or at least it seems to me. Daniel?
Well, I think we're looking at time and reality in different ways to the people who first pioneered these traditions. The average modern yoga practitioner is not coming to class to escape from a cycle of births. And that is where these traditions began. And obviously the philosophy behind that, the way of looking at the world, can translate into looking at one lifetime. There is a cycle of cause and effect. There is an interrelationship with things. There is an entanglement of ourselves in unhelpful ways with the world around us that could also be, to a certain extent, upgraded into a more helpful way of relating and engaging. And all of that, I think, was very much on the menu in most early yoga traditions. It's just that they were, for want of a better word, on the whole, quite fundamentalist. If the ultimate objective was to get off the cycle, and the engine that drives the cycle is action, which is fueled by desire, not wanting and not doing became very important, at least in the more ascetic branches of yoga. And some of that has continued into the modern era. Mary mentioned control. The earliest definition of yoga we know of, restraint of the mind and the senses, in the Katha Upanishad. There's a lot of restraining gone on in the way that modern asana has been instructed. We've all had some exposure to the methodology of Mr. Iyengar, and there was a lot of attempts to control things there that perhaps took it a little bit too far. In fact, it's quite unhelpful to a certain degree to be that focused on controlling. And there were many traditions of yoga that said the same thing. The Bhagavad Gita was 2,000 years ago criticizing the ascetics who tried to control everything and not do anything. So there are sort of countercurrents in yoga history, but there hasn't, for the most part, been an emphasis on health and wellness and becoming better integrated members of society until the modern era. The fact that things do continue to evolve, as Rod said, is a very good thing. It would be unlikely that yoga would be as popular as it is had it no interest in the world around us, or being practiced by householders for material benefits. But you're right, there was a more transcendent objective, I think, at the core of yoga traditions that wasn't about this world. It was about seeing beyond the illusions of worldly pleasures, that in the end this world could never provide the satisfaction that we might seek, and that could perhaps be found if we related to it from a different place, instead of thinking of ourselves as needy individuals who have to get what they want. And modern people, for the most part, are quite attached to getting what they want. So I think it's quite helpful to bring some of the philosophical perspective of ancient yoga traditions into the modern practice space, just to remind us of the ideas that have driven paths out of suffering, but also to remember that some of the methods that were advocated previously might not be to our tastes, and it's quite helpful that they've been perhaps left by the wayside.
Would you say that the juncture is definitely the 20th century, or do we find forays into a more pragmatic sense of looking at the body, Daniel, before the 20th century in such texts as Yoga Chintamani or the Hatha Abhyasa Padati? Would you say that we start to see a creep towards the use of yoga asana as something that can help someone live a more comfortable life in this birth and this body?
To a certain extent, going back again to the Bhagavad Gita, that's talking about basically, it's not asana practice at all. It just says sit up straight and meditate is the only reference to anything physical in that sense. But it was very much oriented towards being effective in the world. And you can go back further than there to the Buddha himself, who had a go at various forms of ascetic austerity and said, this is pointless. This is self-torture. And that's not going to lead me out of suffering. It's going to create suffering. And so he had a slightly different spin on things that definitely influenced texts like the Gita. So I think you can go back a long way and see a different way of approaching things. But there's something specific from, I'd say, maybe the mid-19th century onwards that is really focused on health and well-being. And that starts to, I think, develop partly because of the influence of modern science, partly because of the impact of colonialism that led to exchanges of ideas between the East and the West, partly due to the prevalence of physical training of other sorts that influenced the development of postural yoga practice, whether that's martial arts or physical exercise, gymnastics. All these things have an influence.
It is also partly to do with the shifts in social structures and technology, modern technologies in the world, allowing for a sense that life isn't just kind of a drudgery to get through. There's something that has to be suffered, and one hopes for some kind of better life next time, or in Christian terms, less time in purgatory or something. You can actually enjoy a life when technology makes life a little bit more pleasant, and also the individual has a sense of looking for meaning in their own experience rather than perhaps our more collective sense of meaning making, which we also see probably, up to around a similar time that you mentioned, let's say, mid 1800s. Richard, I've got a little question for you up my sleeve, and it is one of your favourite subjects, I think, Patanjali. We all know how much Richard loves Patanjali. And I thought
it has brackets too.
Yeah, and I thought to ask you, Richard, not to put you on the spot, well, how relevant? Talking about transcendence, and Patanjali kind of seemed to like a little bit of a transcendental perspective on yoga, and modern yoga very much emphasizes Patanjali, which is a little bit of a bugbear to me as well. I have to say that if you do a YTT these days, they're pretty much the only thing that you'll learn about yoga philosophy, oftentimes, unless you do one with Daniel or something like that, is Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And so my question to you, Richard, on a very basic level, is how relevant is Patanjali to the modern yoga student, looking at this shift that we might see in modern yoga towards embodiment?
Patanjali is a compiler. So he doesn't really teach anything at all. If you're going to study the Yoga Sutra, you've got to study the commentaries, which is where they put the meat on the bones, so to speak. I think probably in the 20th and 21st centuries, the original core of the practice has been reinterpreted slightly to make it more palatable to the 21st century student. So, There's nothing wrong with the yamas, particularly the niyamas. I mean, it gives the impression that there's only 5 of each, but in fact, there's dozens of yamas and niyamas, which you could get a more welcoming experience with some of the other yamas and niyamas. They talk about being hospitable and helping other people, which I think is very important. So I think in the context of the 21st century, the interpretation of Patanjali, the sutras were made to be interpreted. It's more relevant than it might be if you looked at a commentary like Vyasa's commentary or the earlier ones. Relevance, yes, but I think there are texts, books are more relevant than the Yoga Sutra.
I think one thing that we're forgetting in this discourse a little bit is that these texts are describing something that's actually going on inside each of us. And so everyone has actually incredible context already, whether they've read or not read all of these things, because they're living inside this thing called the body, the life, and they're having to deal with all these conflicts and suffering, and they're having to make some way through it. And so the ordinary person is already transversing, if you will, all these scriptures, all these writings. It's just sometimes what you get from a book or sort of a text is that you're actually maybe reorganizing some of your own views and thoughts, or you're categorizing some of your own views and thoughts that you're actually going through. Otherwise, you'd have no reference to any of these things. The reference is actually going on inside oneself. And these things are helping us clarify some of the feelings, thoughts, and sensations that we're actually experiencing every moment of our life. So, when you say that, what is the relevance of these things? It's not like the human being has changed all that much in the last 10,000 years, maybe 10 million years. Some of the social contexts have changed, but a lot of the internal landscape is, I would argue, actually incredibly the same. And so we have to actually contextualize these writings through our experience.
I totally agree with that, Rodney. I mean, I think that oftentimes I'm struck by the people wanting to get definite conclusions. Tell me what it is I'm meant to be doing in yoga, what it is I'm meant to be feeling and thinking, rather than thinking, well, in the Socratic idea of kind of getting something out of oneself at the end. Almost like kind of Vivekananda said, Daniel, that, go into your own room and get the Upanishads out of yourself. And which also is a juncture, again, though, to come back to this modern, pre-modern yoga, because obviously that's rather heretical in the yoga tradition, where you really almost defer to a text or a guru, for someone to tell you what to think and to do. And yes, Daniel.
I would actually perhaps quibble with that, because in the yoga tradition, certainly, we're talking about Patanjali, the main source of valid knowledge is pratyaksha, so direct experience. And it's actually a tradition more like Vedanta that is placing primacy on the text. So for a yoga practitioner, Rodney's right. It's the field of one's own perception that is of interest. But I do think that there is another problem that can arise from exploring for oneself and then turning to texts, and that's to assume that what one finds in the text relates to what one is doing, which it may or it may not. We might not have the same objective of that system. We might not be striving for the same results that it's trying to encourage. And Richard was alluding to one, the niyama of shaucha does not mean cleaning your yoga clothes and being in good shape to come to class so that you don't stink the room out. It is a purification process that it's impossible to complete. It says actually, the real purification of the mind is to understand that the body can't be purified. It's disgusting flesh suit oozing stuff out of every orifice, and the yogi should look at it thus and be prepared to give it up, become an ascetic, and let go of of the body. So it's a meditation on death, effectively, which is also there in the Satipatthana Sutta, the foundation of mindfulness. So modern mindfulness practice doesn't talk about, contemplating your body as a rotting corpse being feasted on by vultures any more than the average yoga asana class asks students to think of themselves that way. But that's a potentially, helpful practice. But Patanjali is not just suggesting it as an object of contemplation. He really is encouraging the yogi to be disinterested in materiality. And so that's a different project. So whatever's going on in our experience, to assume that that's what Patanjali was saying, I think is potentially fraught with risk. It's sometimes easier to talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and to think about some of the core principles that are inspiring some of these earlier authors, and to see how we might find our own way of working with those, such as, how to deal with the fact that we delude ourselves and we tell ourselves all sorts of stories that we think are true in order to avoid facing what's actually true. In relation to the world beyond us, that's particularly important. The whole political domain is full of propaganda designed to, delude us and stop us from seeing things as they are. So in some ways, yoga practice could be a tool for unwinding that unhelpful tendency, but only if we're thinking about it and trying to see the ways in which we do fool ourselves.
I've been thinking about this a lot, Daniel, and I listened to a couple of your tapes on yoga recently, just so I could catch myself up with you, because you're the least person that I know on this podcast. And I was struck by the idea of something I've been resisting for a long time, and that is bhakti yoga, devotional yoga. And the reason I say that upon what you just said is that it's hard to trust one's own perspective on oneself. It seems like an impossible task. And so I need friends like Mary and Richard to tell me, wow, Rodney, you are so full of it. So I consider them my teachers in that way. And I really have a problem. And as I look at all of us on this podcast, I realize that we've been rebels. Most of us are rebels, and actually probably have a hard time with bhakti yoga. But at the same time, I realized, wow, that is really a problem for me.
I think one of the most important things about a public yoga class is helping people to become more self-aware of themselves, be able to make those distinctions between what's real for them and what's not, and also to slow people down. In my classes, people want to get into the asana without any consciousness of how to get into it properly first, and then come out of it. So I think it's important for people to slow down and be aware of themselves.
That brings us on to another question, Richard. I was going to ask, when we talk of awareness, and I often hear this all the time, it's got a passioner-esque kind of type to be most aware of one's experiences of one's body, one's mind. And I'll ask a stupid question: why, in a certain sense? I mean, they seem obvious, but what is the context now of awareness? I mean, previously you might say awareness of non-duality or of a no self, or but vis-a-vis Daniel and Rodney's little discussion, the context being everything. Where are we at now with the use of awareness in modern yoga, or are we just kind of overly? Because I could see it could rather end into a hyper vigilant sense of oneself, almost narcissistic sense of self-awareness, with this kind of focus on one's own experience on the yoga mat, etc., and going out daily life and how I'm interacting with other people. Of course, one should be reasonably self-aware, but is there a limit to that? Could one tip over into a slight over-analyzation of everything that one does?
I think you can be aware of yourself pretty much consistently through the day. I try to do that myself. It's not easy to do because you get caught up in the outside world. Most people are looking outside most of the time. I think most of my students are involved in their daily lives, but they don't really connect themselves. They don't really connect themselves internally to that life. They don't really understand what they're doing, what they're saying. Well, self-awareness is not. It isn't anything. It's just being aware, watching yourself without any kind of preconceptions or expectation. It's just being there.
Well, I just wonder, it has limits though, but that, perhaps I don't need to go further down this line, but I remember Werner Herzog said, when you inhabit a house and illuminate every last corner of it, then that house becomes uninhabitable in the end. I quite like that. I mean, do you really want to illuminate every last corner of your house? Mary, yeah, great.
I mean, what you're bringing up is so interesting, because I think we do see sometimes in yoga practitioners and spiritual practitioners a hypersensitivity, which I think is a little different than a broader sense of awareness. And I mean, my experience in the Buddhist practice, what was so helpful was opening my awareness. What I did was I built myself into a prison with my practice. I worked really hard, and I could do things that I can't do now, but I could do a lot of things. And in the Iyengar world, you never get praise for anything, but I did get a little praise now and then, which was strange. But I was completely unaware. And what the Buddhist practice helped me with was to open up how much I had shut down a broader, the kind of awareness that Richard is talking about. The sense of living in this world and relating to people, and not being so attached to the performance aspect of the practice. I got to a place where my periods disappeared. I was losing weight. I couldn't eat enough during the day to just keep
that
going.
Happens in Iyengar as well as Ashtanga, does it?
Oh boy.
Well,
yeah.
At least we can draw solace to that. Yeah.
Yeah. No. So I do think that what I cannot see any, and I'd love to hear from the others, where awareness, and if it's tainted with a hypersensitivity, and a reactivity rather than a responding, element, I can't see where awareness can go wrong in many ways. The different levels of opening up. I feel like my practice is each stage where I've managed to move through some of these challenges that I think we all have, and awoken to a deeper level, a more subtle level. And in my case, it was opening more to the more feminine side and the more yin side of things. And opening to pregnancy that happened, and opening to people like Emily Conrad and Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. That helped inform my yoga practice. And I needed that broader awareness to simply be kinder to myself, and to actually operate in the world with more sense of connection, I would say. I think, and what I see with practitioners who seem to have evolved over time, that there is a softening and an opening in the awareness that, it's a thread, like William Stafford's poem. It's like a thread that's always there, that keeps, recycling and awakening people to sort of different levels of experience. So, but I'd be interested to hear, what Daniel has to say, or Richard.
There you go, Daniel.
In at the deep end, yeah. Well, I think, the main thing that yogic traditions have always been encouraging us to be aware of is what we are conditioned by, the experiences that we've had and the thoughts that we've had about them, and the self-referential thinking that sustains these patterns and gets us habituated into what Mary was alluding to, automatic reactivity in response to the things that we either like and want more of, or dislike and want to push away. And because we're all sensitive in some way to being triggered, the modern world is full of lots of people activating each other's triggers. And the more aware we can be about our own conditioning, the greater the potential to become a little bit less activated and to have a bit more capacity to choose our response to what's coming at us, but then also perhaps to not be triggering other people. And so if the whole world is sort of on this hyper-vigilant level of, this is the way that social media discourse functions. Everybody's sort of preparing their next punch before they've read what came at them, in order to try and win some sort of battle for the most part. Instead, the kind of communication that would help the world, obviously, is to be able to hear one another, to be receptive without feeling threatened by even the things we don't like hearing, instead of trying to push them away or tell the author that they're wrong. And so it seems to me that the more aware we are of the way in which we are pre-programmed, the more chance we have of doing things a little bit more skillfully. So awareness seems to me the core of getting somewhere with this practice, but it may or may not be developed by anything that we do. Certainly no guarantee of it coming from us in the practice. You might pay attention to what you're doing, but then just be fixated, as Mary was suggesting, on the performance, or blinding perhaps oneself to the ways in which doing that is causing potential damage to the body because we're so fixated on the result. And that doesn't seem to be very skillful or very helpful or very aware. But there's a lot of doing it because of the obsession with getting somewhere. And actually, awareness isn't about getting anywhere. It just is.
So Daniel and Mary, the question of Dharma comes up to me again, in the sense of, do we just have to trip over what we're going to trip over? And hopefully we don't have to do it so many times that it just keeps on repeating this sort of cat chasing its tail type of thing. Because it seems to me that the problem with awareness, Richard, is that it's always seems to be tainted by my desires. And so therefore, it's always going to be, I can't seem to get rid of the root of myself. Therefore, I really have tainted awareness, which then basically screws up the whole experiment. So I like that maybe after a certain amount of years, there's a certain wisdom that takes place, because you get a little bit more, as Robinson Jeffers, one of my favorite poems, Ticky-Tacky Houses, it ends with the line, "We must decentralize ourselves on ourselves." And, and like, wow, the earth isn't the center of the universe. like, how are we going to figure that out? Because we have all kinds of examples around us all the time that should make us laugh at ourselves. I mean, really, because it's completely a comedic joke constantly. And I can't seem to get out of the labyrinth of this joke.
I think self-awareness is a process, Rodney. You start off at a certain level, and it's sort of like you're digging more deeply into yourself all the while. And I think also that very bare awareness is transformative in its own way. You find out things about yourself, and it's like the observer effect. I'm not sure I'm using that phrase properly, but if you watch your breath long enough and with enough attention, your breath begins to change. Your breath begins to slow down, smooth out. I think there's a similar effect on your person, on your being, as you increase your self-awareness.
Yeah, I kind of feel like maybe awareness perhaps like a revolving door. You have to go in, but you have to at a certain point revolve outwards as well. Otherwise, perhaps you're becoming less aware. One needs to be aware of one's inner experiences, but at a certain point, that needs to kind of be contextualized within a wider perspective as to one's inner experiences and other people's possible experiences. So if awareness doesn't spread outwards from looking in a bit, then I kind of think that we're breeding a lot of perhaps narcissistic yoga practitioners, because of that, going back to Mary's point, perhaps, and this might be an opposite point to bring it in, is does this yoga have a social political element to it, Mary? Traditionally, Daniel might mention as well that yoga isn't particularly interested in the politics of living together, we assume, but it seems that increasingly people are very interested in the yoga world about other people's politics these days. Certainly some people are in mine anyway. Daniel and Mary, I think you might both have something to say on that.
I'll let Mary go first, I think.
prepare your next punch.
Well, I met Daniel at our local, what's called the Not So Simple Living Festival, which I think you were on a mission, for a journalistic mission, looking at.
I was writing about solar panels and things. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah, and he showed up at. It's a little festival where some of the people in the area who've been here for a while teach skills about living on the land, and I have always felt that yoga was very much part of that. And then he just popped into one of the classes, and we had a nice chat. And then your yoga career was just amazing to watch, actually, after that. So it was just very, 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 very nice to meet you then. But I've always felt, I think, as there's two things that are coming up in my mind. One is I am appalled at the state of our yoga community in this country and how COVID has politicized a lot of people. And it has moved much of the yoga community to the right wing and to conspiratorial thinking, to health minister Kennedy. I mean, it is shocking. And I think it touches into a little bit what you were saying, Adam, about this more narcissistic attitude. I want me and my family to be okay. Damn the rest. So I think it can, that attitude can lead to that. But it's been very, very sad to see the divisions and people who I thought we were sort of on the same page, and we talked, the back to nature language. We encouraged each other to have home births, etc., and that kind of thing. Now going completely into the extreme of that and kind of partitioning themselves off. At the same time, I've spent, the last 30 years going down to Cuba and in being involved in a yoga project there. And Rodney's kindly come at the beginning of that project, has been there a couple of times with me, and Richard has assisted and sent materials down there too. And that project really opened me up to the importance of finding our commonality and also seeing things from a very different perspective. And the way that actually in our physical instructions in asana, we can be political. We can actually tie people's bodies down that actually are not appropriate to that culture. And that's been.
Would you give an example of that? That's intriguing.
Well, and these guys are going to laugh at me because I've spent my life trying to untuck people's tailbones because of the utter passion with which that instruction has I think polluted. And particularly when you're looking at a Latino culture, I can give you an example of, this actually wasn't in Cuba, but a Mexican student of mine who was having incredible back pain. And, I just looked at her body and I said, well, could you release the tailbone a little bit? Could we have a slightly different angle on the sacrum? What does that feel like? She went, oh my God. And she said, but that's what I've been told to do. That's what all the American teachers, when they come down here, and the European teachers tell me to do. And, so that you can imprison people in their bodies through your asana instruction. And I have learned a lot about movement from watching Cubans dance and play with their yoga. And that's actually informed my practice a lot. And now, of course, I'm more and more involved in trying to support them in a much bigger political situation where they are severely, severely threatened, and most of them are starving right now. So there's several different aspects there. Yeah.
Mary and I have a workshop titled Bone of Contention about the tailbone. She says one thing,
we
I say
did a
something else.
workshop on the tailbone, didn't we? Yeah.
I have a bone to pick with you.
Yeah.
Any retorts, Daniel?
On yoga and politics, or
do you think that they should be completely separate, or do you think that the modern yoga teacher perhaps does have a responsibility almost to take some interest in the world and the developments?
Well, we live in the world,
life and events.
Yeah. I don't know that it's necessarily to do with yoga in that sense. If we live in the world, we're part of the world. So it's more the other way around, that pretending that there's some way of avoiding worldliness doesn't seem very realistic. Perhaps if one does retreat to the monastery or the cave, then that could be really true. But there is an attempt to do an equivalent of that, as Mary was describing. Retreating to my safe space where I'm surrounded by people who agree with me, and we can all agree that those people over there are the problem and they want me to do things that I don't want to do. And because nobody's talking about that on the channels that I used to get my information from, I'm going to go looking for other channels. And then down that pipe comes a load of other stuff that I'd never heard before that sounds kind of plausible and fascinating. And, it gives me more reasons to say these guys are the problem. And, bang, up goes a rocket. And so all of that is, I think, a very good example of people who were not very politically aware suddenly finding political reality hit them in the face, affected them. Made them close their yoga studio, for example, for a period at least, told them that they might need to have a vaccine that they didn't want, and then they got massively triggered. And because they didn't have a particularly skillful way of thinking about the structural injustice of the world, they decided that the thing that had happened to them was the most important, terrible crime against humanity that needed to be resisted at all costs. And of course, people found many things that happened in the COVID period frustrating, deeply troubling, whatever we want to call it. But it was just one of many things. And I saw a lot of political illiteracy converted into certainties overnight that perhaps wouldn't have happened had those people been a bit more switched on to the way the world worked for a lot longer, and also less focused on themselves, frankly, because there's much more suffering outside of our own mind-body system than there is within it, for the most part, unless we're very unlucky. Most of us are actually relatively privileged, and although we have our concerns and we need to attend to them, there are much more serious issues out there in the world. So I think if we're thinking about living in the world, it's part of the reality that we're involved with to pay attention to some of those other things. And that brings me back, I suppose, to the original comment that you made about Iyengar and alignment leading to enlightenment. We can't escape our interconnection to other forms of life. We wouldn't be able to breathe were there not trees and other plants producing oxygen for us. So there is an interdependent relationship. It helps to find ways of reminding ourselves of that. And part of how we fit into a bigger picture is a reason to take an interest in politics. That also relates to Rodney's question about bhakti. You can't put yourself at the center of the universe if you put something else there. So the devotional mindset does have a function in that sense. And we might not be called to worship gods, but we could worship life rather than our own self-interest. And then the final thing is, even once we've got down that road of thinking, well, I live in the world, I need to pay attention and have some engagement with it, I'm not sure that yoga texts have got the blueprints for what to do about it. So, in the end, I'm not sure that yoga and politics mix all that well, but that by being yoga practitioners, to pretend that we can get away from the messy business of worldliness seems deluded. And if you go to the other extreme and then start trying to sort of weaponize the yamas and niyamas or the Bhagavad Gita or whatever it might be to back our particular political preference, that's just unskillful. There are many more insightful sources we could draw on to make our points. So I do think there are principles in yoga traditions, such as the idea that we're perhaps all in our different spaces and able to access a similar insight that should remind us of our underlying connection and similarity. But I don't think that we can really turn that into a political philosophy in and of itself, unless it's going to be as simplistic as kumbaya, can't we all get along?
And one thing is obvious for everyone, I think, is that we have these so-called influencers these days, huge amount of followers, and they're kind of expected to speak and have an opinion on these things, and that opinion is hearsay valid because, well, they have this number of influencers, have this number of followers on this subject, so therefore they're inherently, whatever they say on any subject then has a value. I mean, the two other things, Daniel, I might say, well, when I got into yoga, it was definitely about tolerance, and tolerance of other people's opinions was a big deal, I think, and almost that kind of more, let's say, fatalistic idea that let people do what they want to do, and the so-called turn the other cheek kind of philosophy, little bit, let's say, stand backish, and that paradox perhaps contrasted with the use of, say, the Bhagavad Gita as a text we see in the start of the 20th century with certain freedom fighters in India who interpret the Bhagavad Gita for, you must stand up, you must, fight the noble fight. And it's your obligation to actually, fight for what is right. So, there's two contrary positions there, perhaps, but certainly increasingly, and I've had this myself, and people expect me to say, that I'm not going to go to certain places, or I am going to go to certain places, and quite vociferous about me having certain political objectives in and where I teach. So that's rather another minefield to navigate, really.
What's interesting to me, Adam, is this word that Daniel was saying, people are unskillful, because I think it goes back to one of the definitions of yoga, skill and action. And I think that what Mary's talking about politically too is a certain kind of ignorance that one's willing to stand on. Because they actually maybe don't have doubt. I love the fact that we get so certain of things that we haven't even researched very well at all. And I think that where research leads us to is actually uncertainty, which is actually a really stunning thing. And Mary, so far as the political world, because I've always admired you so much about dedicating your life. And when I went down to Cuba with you, I realized how ignorant I was about what offerings they had to the yoga world. It's incredible that they were like living yoga from a really deep place, because they weren't able to actually connect in some ways to the plethora of information that a lot of us were privileged to have. But because of that, I found their practice actually way more deep, way more humanistic. We have a hard time in this society and in the West, I'm going to say in the West, of extracting this tooth of ignorance of trying to be special, and this ignorance of like putting ourselves above. It's really insidious. And so politically, I feel like there's a real problem in a very, very deep level. And I think we've all been trying to pierce it through the practice of trying to figure out how to listen. And that is like, I love what Richard Freeman says. He interprets, Chitta Vritti Nirodha, Adha Yogam, he interprets, and now yoga, and now listen. So ceasing the fluctuations of your mind in some ways is the ability to listen. Mm-hmm. So basically, I had to figure out how to turn myself off in some ways to actually be in the world. Because otherwise the world is not being offered to me.
Actually, Mary, I have a particular question on your work in Cuba. I suppose, don't get me wrong, but why bring yoga to them? Don't they have in their own practices? There's a lot of dance there, there's a lot of music there. Do they need yoga? Do they need to be taught yoga? Can they not do the work that they need to for themselves through their own indigenous practices, cultural practices that they already have there?
Yeah, great question. There's no need to bring yoga to Cubans. I was down there visiting, and I was asked to just share. It was just one of the wonderful teacher there, Eduardo Pimentel, who a lot of people know. just asked me to share some things. And it wasn't me bringing yoga. It wasn't that at all. It was more an exchange. We called it a cultural exchange. So we would bring materials and books, and I brought, when it was legal, I brought teachers like Rodney and, some really great teachers, Ramajyoti Vernon, and some teachers from England, Christina Feldman, a Vipassana teacher. So, we did, but it was more in the spirit of exchange. And in the end, we did do a couple of very long teacher training programs, long because it was just the situation there is very complicated in terms of just having a space. I remember T.S. Little coming on one of the trips and asking people, they said, well, what do we need for a yoga practice? He said, well, you need a quiet room with no interruptions. And the Cubans just laughed, just like, so for me, it was an exchange because I was constantly, like Rodney said, their practice, because, books are so hard to come by, cheap, the influences so hard to come by, that their practice goes deep. It's like they don't have a lot of the distractions. So to hear them teach is really inspirational. And you're right. The music, the dance, that is such a fundamental part of their lives, but it informs the yoga in a way that I think is incredibly interesting. And we brought Cuban teachers here, but we can't do that. We haven't been able to do that for years now. And many of the people that we know have left the country, died, or are just living in very difficult conditions now. So it's more like just trying to support them. But I just want to, I loved what both, you guys said. I think the role, I see myself as an engaged mystic. I think, just simple, basic political propaganda, I'm very wary of. And I'd have to be a little careful with myself because I have opinions. And I really, and I do get told that, you're a bloody communist or something like that from people. But I try to inform, but I also, one of my first teachers, Penny Neal Smith in London, I remember her on the Cali Road. We would come to class and we would all come late because she would shower us with political posters. We've got to go to the whale demonstration. We've got to end nuclear disarmament. And, we've got to do all these things. And we would come in, we'd be exhausted. So we would come late. And then she figured that out. So instead she would give the flyers at the end of class when we came out of Shavasana. And that was like people would start to leave early. So then she started to do it in the middle. And I remember thinking, I am never going to do that. I love her. I love her causes, but I am never going to do that because yoga is a refuge and this is the place that we come to. It's a sanctuary. And one of the other things that I think is so important and is happening everywhere is the way that people are creating community and how important that is at this time. The communities that Rodney and Richard created down at Piedmont, they continue everywhere. And the communities, I'm sure you're doing the same thing, Daniel, and you with your retreats, Adam. I mean, those kind of communities, I think they support people at this time, which is a really, really difficult time. And that the Sangha, taking refuge in the Sangha, as the Buddhists would say, I think is super, super valuable, because we are dealing with tremendous uncertainty.
I think as we get our villages and our Sanghas, we just have to be careful of then that letting it be the skin of ourselves, because then that excludes again. I hate being part of the East Coast, partly because there's these traditional clubs that this Chinese boy can't be a part of. No, and so I want to make it clear that that we have to be ultra careful in our communities. And that's why when we even say Iyengar yoga or Patabi Joys or Krishnamacharya, they mean nothing to me at this time. I mean, Iyengar was a guy that got stuck in a room by Krishnamacharya and said, figure out this pose. Like, there was nothing, there's no Iyengar yoga. It was just a guy working deeply in his body and coming up with some helpful roadmaps that may or may not apply to you. And whether it's Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen or, Emily Conrad, they're just ways. That's why Bruce Lee is a hero sometimes for me, because he's like, he learned all these techniques and then he basically said, yes, but no. Be water, my friend. It's Lao Tzu, it's like water, like surround and be the container that you're in.
Or equally, a good teacher frees their student from their own influence. That's probably a good place to go to wrap up now and ask the last question. Where are we going now with the yoga? I mean, Mary mentioned the importance of developing communities, and we could say we're in a kind of post-lineage, certainly with Rodney's comments on BKS, with certainly, and my own Ashtanga yoga. Obviously, we lost Pattabhi Joyce, and for more than one reason, and Sharat Joyce's passing recently puts Ashtanga in a funny position as well. So where is modern yoga evolving now? Or perhaps interestingly, where would you like it? Where would you like it to go? Is there any changes that you could see that you would like to see develop in these coming, say, 10 next years? Rodney?
Well, I like what Richard said once to me. He said, Rodney, we don't have a soul. The soul has us. And I feel the tidal wave of yoga has me. I'm inside a much bigger house than I can ever dream of. And so I'm a part of it. I'm a particle of water in an ocean, but I really don't surmise I have that much control. Really, I think control is just a figment of your own sort of ego. So, what would I like to see? I would like to see people drop away from the commercial aspects and drop away from the hungry ghost of themselves, like trying to chase their own tail to achieve something that they actually don't even want. I was teaching Navy SEALs recently. And I said, what do you guys want? And they said, well, we want peace. And I said, really? Do you really want peace? I mean, do you know how difficult what you're asking in your training? Do you think that leads to what you really want? I'm like, you guys want excitement. You don't want peace. And they really were like taken back. It's like people say they want something, but they're actually not going after it at all. They're really feeding a whole different container. People have to really look at what they really want, and they have to then ask, what technique helps me get there?
Yeah, very true. Very true. Daniel, I haven't heard from you.
I think Richard was going to speak, I think, so
Richard?
I'll let him go first.
Okay.
I think it's important to remember that we're all yoga children right now. You can trace yoga in India back at least to the Katha Upanishad for 2,400 years. But in this country, we've only had yoga for maybe 130 years if you start from Vivekananda. So we're just little babies. We're wiggling our fingers for mudras, and we're going ba 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 for mantra. We're crawling around on the floor for asana. I think it's going to take a while for us to develop that kind of awareness that Indian yoga apparently has for itself. So I think we got to give ourselves a break. Let's see what's going to happen next. But I think we're off to a good start with teachers like Rodney and Mary and Daniel.
Ever the optimist. Daniel, I'm sure you're not so optimistic about the situation.
Well, I mean, I see many reasons to get very concerned. The state of the world is not inspiring on all sorts of levels, and the way in which technology is contaminating yoga, firstly with the social media marketing and commoditization dimension of things, secondly with the potential invention of all manner of new modalities to fake it until you make it, perhaps. If you could just push a button and enter all the yogic states that have ever been described, would that be the same thing? I would say no, because the whole point of the practice is to transform really the heart, one's capacity to relate to things from a different way of being. And if all you're doing is just collecting states and experiences, or buying them, even worse, then I don't think that transformation necessarily happens. So I think it would be good to continue to look backwards as part of the process of moving forwards, to just try to remember what some of these core principles were, so that we don't lose sight of them altogether. Otherwise, what are we bequeathing the next generation?
And how can we call it yoga that we're doing in the first place? How would you define them? Ask a silly question. How would you define the that tenuous link between modern and pre-modern yoga?
Well, I think I'll come back to Mary's very catchy phrase that I liked a lot about being an engaged mystic. I have opinions here about what I think's important, but I think it's actually important that all practitioners consider for themselves what's important and why. If really the only reason that you're practicing yoga is to look good naked, own it. It's fine. But it's the problem when people are saying they want one thing while chasing another, as Rodney was pointing out. So I think it's good for everybody to just ask the simple question of, why do I do what I'm doing? Is what I'm doing taking me towards that? If I really want to get there, how would I need to engage in this what to ensure that some of the why is there? I don't want to prescribe anything necessarily. I'm not the yoga police. There's so many different versions of yoga. It's entirely up to you. You can be a world renouncer if you want to. You can be a kind of a martyr to the cause and take the Bhagavad Gita as your instruction manual for transforming the world, should you wish to. People have done those things in large numbers, both of them. So I'm not going to say one thing's right or wrong, but the one core thing does seem to be there that I was alluding to, which is about transformation. So if all we're doing is getting more rigidly attached to our own sense of what we want and our neediness around the securing of it, then I don't know that that's got a lot to do with what was called yoga. And if that's what's just promoted, then perhaps it deserves a new name. But no way am I going to win that war. So I'll step back and let people just think for themselves. Are they really clear why they're calling their practice yoga? And if not, maybe they'd like to study a little more. And I'd be glad for them to come and join me on a course.
The path of knowledge. It's a year-long course with Daniel Simpson. Please sign up. Transformation, yeah, definitely. But then again, come back to that context, the context of awareness, the context of transformation, and going back to your clarification on your somewhat pushback on the Patanjali idea, that there's still a context around Patanjali's direct perception. I mean, this is the rub, as it were. Patanjali says, pratyaksha is the main thing, and then you've got, inference, and then you've got scriptural study. But he still says, if we're to understand even that Patanjali potentially wrote that commentary, there's a clear, there's a definitely clear context around one's perception of brahmacharya. It's not like just having sex with one person at a time. It's, clearly don't have any sex. So, I mean, this is the rub, isn't it? There isn't really a context around modern yoga to keep it somewhat corralled into a certain order. And that's as far as I can see it, or at least the context that we have isn't fleshed out enough in terms of using, we've mentioned the Yoga Sutras, we've mentioned the Bhagavad Gita as two seminal texts that are used. And perhaps we need to also expand outwards in our understanding nowadays and use some Western texts as well, use some fiction, use some poetry. I mean, Rodney was quoting poetry. I think Mary quoted a poem earlier, just to kind of flesh out a wider context around this inquiry towards somewhat bettering ourselves in the world, I suppose. Mary, you might have something to say. What direction would you say you'd like to see yoga going?
I just want to appreciate Richard has always reminded us that we're such babies. We are such babies, and that we're in such a early stage of the evolution. And I think that's really helpful. And along that, one of the things I would love to see more of, and I feel that I and others didn't do so well as in our training programs, is more really taking mentorship more seriously. Because I feel like we train people and then we're out the door. And I mean, I think in some some groups and some traditions, they're much better at bringing people back and checking in. But I feel that I've sort of slipped into that role a little bit in my dotage. But I feel like that's something I would love could be more evolved, because you don't just become a teacher. You need further input, and you need a community. I also think more discussions like this, Adam, and I listened to a few of I have to say, I hadn't listened to your podcast before, if I'm honest, but I did. And I really appreciate all the different people that you bring in and all the conversations. And it really got me thinking about a few things that had just got a little dusty in my head. So that kind of further interplay and communication, I think, is super, super healthy and very, very valuable to everybody. So thank you for that.
Concluding remark, Daniel.
If I may be so bold, and to continue the flavour of poetry, I quoted a poem by T.S. Eliot in whatever one calls these things, an epigram. I can't remember the quote at the beginning of a book, and it's from the Four Quartets. It says, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time."
I mean, case in point, I think Four Quartets, a wonderful text. I would like to see people bring that into the yoga sphere. But I mean, it's another question, isn't it? And
he borrowed quite a bit of Indian thought in the writing of it as well. And The Wasteland also quotes the earliest Upanishads. So.
Yeah, true. Richard, any thoughts as we draw to the conclusion?
I think we should move more toward develop more Western ideas for our yoga. I think oftentimes we misinterpret the traditional ideas, which we should respect, but we misuse the traditional ideas, and it confuses people. It confuses me, and I think we should begin to develop our own ideas about the subtle body, and where the practice is actually going to take us. I don't know about enlightenment. I don't really believe in enlightenment, but I think we should all become more conscious of ourselves over time. I think that's the most important thing in the future for Western yogis, is to become more aware, and become more aware not only of ourselves but of ourselves in the, as Mary was saying, in the context of the larger world.
Yeah, I suppose that's exactly what I've been angling around in this worry or a sense of concern that we might be appropriating, that we might be kind of colonizing yoga once again with Western perspectives. There's also this denigration of our own perception about what we're doing as well, I'd say. And perhaps that needs to also be balanced, as Daniel said, with some original ideas about what yoga was, and to allow that we don't go completely off course, but by the same token also to bring to bear our own honest thoughts about what we're doing now.
I think one of the main things is to remember that yoga is a tool. AI is a tool. These things are tools in which we are actually maybe creating a more complete understanding of self-awareness. And AI is going to be a massive tool that I think we have never encountered. And it cannot be compared to any other technology. And I think it has, just like the internet in its initial incarnation, was really a big promise for democracy. It was actually a big promise for hearing the voices around the world. And then it got used as a tool for actually complete siloing and isolation and separation. And so we have to really be careful how we use our tools. And there's no easy way to say that. And I agree with Richard, we're infants, but the problem with being infant at this point in time is that we can be really destructive. So I think we better grow up fast. And I think we need to help other people. Actually, again, I'm just going to say, we need to actually help people have tools to listen to people they would not normally sit down and have dinner with. We always invite the people who are like-minded. All of us do. It's very difficult to actually get someone at your dinner table that's actually quite different from your point of view. I mean, we have a very MAGA, a Trumpian friend, and I try to get to dinner with her as much as possible. But the problem is, to be honest, there's still no dialogue, but though we do have dinner together. And I think that's an important thing to do. And we all have to really look at getting out of our own silo and listen to what we might consider the opposition.
Well, there's no easy way to wrap this up, and we seem to have lost Richard now, unfortunately.
I just would like to say, Adam, that, following from what Rodney says, and what, you scholars have pointed out, including Richard, is that so many influences on the yoga path, that this sense of creating silos or rigidity around certain practices. I mean, the history shows us again and again the power of these different influences and how important it is. I know Rodney's teaching is certainly, and Richard is informed by so many other things. And I'm sure that's the same with you, Daniel. And I haven't had the privilege of your class, Adam, but there's so many other things. And I feel like often in yoga teaching, I was always pushing people out to read poetry, to read history, to look further. And I used to use, students would have to do a 10-day silent retreat, partly because I wanted them to get curious about the ethical codes in Buddhism, which I feel, the Eightfold Path in Buddhism has been so helpful, I think, in terms of ethical guidelines that we in the yoga world are a little confused about. I mean, yes, we got our yamas and niyamas, but I always find that people who have looked at other ways of how to lead a beautiful ethical life seem to mature much more profoundly. Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. So, thank you, Mary Paffard, Daniel Simpson, Rodney Yee, and of course Richard Rosen. Links to everyone's bios and websites, etc., will be in the show notes of this episode, so do check them out. I invited them for very special reasons, very special guests, and I think it's been a wonderful chat. Let us know what you think in the comments. Hope you've enjoyed it, and thanks again for our lovely guests and for spending some time together. It's been a pleasure. Hope you've enjoyed it too. Thank you, Adam.
Very much so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
All of you.
Thank you all.